Hey, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar we're having this morning. We appreciate everybody joining in on the call. My name is Chad LaRoe, and I'm the Business Development Manager here at DogHouse IT. And joining me on the line should be Michael DePalma, Channel Development Manager for Datto. I got you there, Michael?
Got me, Chad. How you doing?
I'm doing great, man. How you doing today?
Fantastic.
So this is, we got a little information we want to provide everybody on something we're pretty passionate about, aren't we?
Absolutely. Yeah, we got a lot of good content here.
Excellent, excellent. Let me ask you first, why should anybody listen to us? What makes us experts on this?
So I'm with a company called Datto. We do backup and disaster recovery, and my role is a little bit unique where most of my time I'm spent out on the road kind of sitting on panels. I've sat on panels with the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, some other cybersecurity experts, some ex-hackers. And so I've heard a lot of stories of what's out there, what's kind of being done to combat it, what's coming up down the road, what the government's worried about. And so I've kind of taken some of that and condensed it down into this webinar. So hopefully some folks get a lot of use out of it.
Absolutely. And from our end, I can definitively say that we pretty much exclusively count on Datto as being our subject matter experts, right? So we're, at DogHouse, we're kind of in, a bunch of different security fields, and, we're tackling a bunch of different, sometimes it feels like drinking from a fire hose with all the security issues we're dealing with. And you guys are our definitive subject matter experts on this particular topic. From my standpoint, in the field and kind of where my value comes in this conversation is that I've met with hundreds of business owners. I'm much more on the street talking to people that are, trying to come up with plans for this, for their security and for their disaster recovery. And so I'm kind of, very much with my ear to the ground on it. Make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah, it makes complete sense. Yep.
Well, maybe together we can bring some folks some good information today.
Sounds good. All right, let's get started. So I mentioned I work for a company called Datto. So we are one of the leaders in business continuity, backup, disaster recovery. We're actually located in Norwalk, Connecticut. It's about 40 miles east of Manhattan, but we've got 26 offices around the world, over 1,400 employees worldwide. We actually have one of the largest private clouds in the world. We protect close to 400 petabytes of data in our 9 data centers. We've got 2 data centers here in America, one in Reading, Pennsylvania, one out in Salt Lake City, Utah. So for American clients, all the data obviously stays here, which is important. And the way that we operate is we've got strategic partners really all over the world that we work with. And as Chad mentioned, DogHouse IT Solutions is one of our strategic partners, and that's why we have a lot of good dialogue back and forth and sharing ideas and all that type of stuff. So the real theme of this today is kind of what's coming up down the road, what we see now, what the landscape looks like, and where backup fits into that. Because most people think about cybersecurity, they think about all the measures that you take on the front end, right? We have your firewalls, your antivirus, everything to try to keep these criminals from getting in. But truly, your last line of defense is your backup, and as many security measures we put in place up front, it really is important what you have as your backup, and if you are attacked, how quickly can you get back up and running? And this is actually one of the things that the criminals are trying to exploit, because they know most folks out there, although they are making some advancements on their detection on threats coming in, they're not as prepared once those attacks do occur, because most folks are still on traditional backup solutions. Most small businesses that I go out and meet with, they're still backing up with external hard drives or even tape. We still see a lot of tape out there. We are seeing a movement to cloud backups. And although these are all great, and it's obviously better than not having any backup at all, there's some limitations to all of these traditional backup means that the criminals really know about, and they know that they can exploit to try to shut down your business, try to get as much money out of you, whether it's ransom or whatever other ways they're trying to attack you. And so that's really the discussion we're going to try to have today. Those limitations that I mentioned, first and foremost, higher failure rates. Some of the older traditional forms of backup, especially tape, which surprisingly we do still see a lot of companies in all fields still using, there's an extremely high failure rate. There's some studies out there that failure rates of tape backups are anywhere in the 30 to 40% range. And so the criminals are going to rely on the fact that, yes, if I've encrypted your data with ransomware and you go to restore, there's a good chance that you're not going to have that data available to you, and then you're going to have no other recourse but to pay. The other piece to a lot of these traditional backup forms is that it's a manual process, both manually in taking those backups and then manually testing those backups. Most businesses, I'll ask them, okay, how often are you taking backups? Most people could answer that question. Then I say, okay, well, who's testing those backups and how often are you doing that? A lot of times they can't give me a definitive answer on that. And if you're not testing your backups, then there's really no way to tell me exactly how safe your data is. You could say I'm backing up hourly, but then, you get hit with ransomware or your server goes down or whatever kind of form, of downtime occurs, and then you go to restore and you find that then in that emergency situation that your data is not there. And probably the biggest threat is the slow recovery time of this. And this especially impacts the ransomware victims because if you are hit with ransomware and you've got a backup solution, you could say, okay, I could restore my data, I can get back up and running. But have you ever tested how long a restoration like that would take? Would it take 2 hours, 2 days, 2 weeks? That cost of downtime is far more costly than the amount of ransom that they're asking for, and that's why so many people pay. And we'll get into kind of figuring out what that looks like in a minute, but that is really the biggest threat that these guys try to exploit. And then lastly, just risk of infection or theft. A lot of the traditional forms of backups, they really don't have security measures in place to try to combat infection. And most backup solutions in the traditional form, what they are, they basically, their backups layer upon previous backups. So if you have an infection that occurs, there's a risk that all of your backups can be infected as well. And so traditional forms of backups kind of mostly fit into these type of buckets. What intelligent business continuity does is a little bit different. It's a different way of not only taking the backups, but looking at what backups can do. So first and foremost, I mentioned those data centers. You want to have a hybrid solution. You want to have multiple copies of your data in different geographical locations. This is extremely important. If you have your one form of backup in your office or just down the road, and you do run into maybe just a natural disaster, there's a fire, flood, storm, something like that, well now whatever's impacting you in your office potentially can impact your backups as well. So you want to have multiple copies of that data. You want to have the on-premise backup because it's going to be much faster to restore, whether it's a file level restore or virtualization, which I'll get to in a minute. But you also want to have those offsite backups as well. So it's really the best of both worlds. I mentioned a lot of folks are moving to the cloud. That's great. But to only have your data in the cloud, the restoration process could be a little bit slower. I also
this kind of hits it right here too, Michael, doesn't it? I mean, we're trying, I think, as an industry, especially over at you guys at Datto, taking the word backup really isn't even what it's about anymore. I mean, that's kind of the old way of doing things. I mean, we're really focusing more on a continuity plan than we are backup. Is that right?
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people, they think of backup as like this ultimate insurance policy. If everything goes wrong, at least I have a second copy of my data. But the world is moving a lot faster now. So the idea is you have to keep your business up and running when those servers go down. And that's really what business continuity strives to do.
Got it.
Yep. So the automated process would be both on the taking of the backups, setting a schedule and saying I need to take backups every hour, 4 times a day, whatever you want to set your schedule, however aggressive you need to be, but also on the testing of those backups. So you want to manually test those backups. We test the backups daily, but you could set those schedules as well to make sure that the money that you're paying to back up this data is being tested. It's critical because you can't answer your question about how much data you're at risk of losing or how much downtime you're at risk of incurring if it's not aggressively tested. Now, one of the things also is that the way that backups are taken. I mentioned the traditional form of backup, which is taking a backup, then the future backups are going to be kind of layered upon that. And most of those those traditional backups, they're just backing things up at the file level, right? You're gonna tell your backup solution which files and folders you want backed up. Obviously, there's some risks of missing some volumes there, but there's also all you have at the end of the day is files. What we do is called an image-based backup, where we're actually taking a snapshot of that entire system, that entire server. So it's not just capturing the files and folders, but actually the operating systems, the applications, literally everything that's on that server now lives on that on-premise device and also is replicated to those 2 data centers. And what this allows us to do is to virtualize. And this is what Chad was mentioning about business continuity, keeping your business up and running. What virtualization would essentially mean is if your server were to go down, whether it's hit with ransomware, whether it's a server failure, you're able to spin up a virtual machine right from that on-premise device. And everyone that was operating off of that server is now going to be operating off of this device. And it truly does keep your business up and running. And that literally is just a call over to Chad and his team, and he can get that up and running. So Chad, do you have any input on, how does that process normally work with your clients?
It's unbelievable. Yeah, we have had to use it a couple times, and in each case, the technology and the level of service that you guys provide is just absolutely beyond words. We had a client, an HVAC client, located here in Clarksville that was really user error. You clicked on a link with an executable where some ransomware was, attempting to try to get on the network, and started to do some encryption on the server, and we were able to shut it down and spin that local device up virtually, and where they were at risk of losing, who even knows, 20 years worth of data. We were able to quarantine it, contain it, and keep them up and running within. I don't think the entire process took more than about 10 minutes.
Yeah, I go around, I do a lot of demonstrations of this, and, we like to do cool things, light servers on fire, smash laptops, that type of stuff, and show how quickly we can get up and running. And we're not going to get into too much detail about the technology on this, but that would be a good follow-up if you did want to see it in person, or just a demo over the internet. We could definitely set that up with Chad and his team. But, he mentioned being risk of losing data, and one of the other things is with that image-based solution, once we take that image of everything that lives on that server, you set up your schedule, whether it's hourly, however aggressive you need, and we've got what's called inverse chain technology, which is actually proprietary to what we do. And it means that every one of those backup points is independent of one another. So it literally is, if you get an infection, you roll back to that last clean backup and you get up and running. We could delete that infected image. So, you're not really at risk of losing previous backups. And so when we look at the landscape right now of what we're seeing in the IT space and the cybersecurity space, ransomware still remains the kind of hot button topic. It's been growing over the years. I've been doing presentations specifically about ransomware for close to 3 years now. And 3 years ago, you'd see some head nods, most people looking at their phones. They didn't really know what it was. And as the years have gone on, more people have been infected. They have a client who's been infected, a vendor. And so they've seen it more and more. And then last year, really splashed on the front page of every paper, lead story on every website, we saw the WannaCry attack, which even for us in the IT space, we had never seen anything like this. This was a single virus that in a single day infected 220,000 computers worldwide. 150 countries were impacted by it. So now it's on the forefront of everyone's mind because they're seeing it. What was interesting about this particular attack is a lot of these criminals in the ransomware space, they try to do some research up front to find out about your business, where you're located, the size of business, so that they could try to get as much money out of you as possible. They want to price that ransom ask at as high as they possibly can. But with this attack, it was across the board only $300. So $300 per attack. They weren't trying to disseminate exactly where you were located, your style of business. And so in the IT field, the consensus was, all right, this was just a test, because they weren't even really trying to monetize it as much as possible. And the FBI said they netted about $300,000, which in the grand scheme of things is not much. So over $1 billion was netted worldwide last year. So $300,000 really wasn't that large of a number for the size of an attack that we saw. So I was doing a presentation alongside a gentleman from the FBI about 2 weeks after this attack occurred, and he was going through some really scary cyber warfare stuff and all the rest. And then he got to ransomware because it was a hot button topic. And what he said was, there's two theories in the FBI. The first one is exactly what I just mentioned. This is a test. So the FBI is starting to prepare as to how to combat that second phase where they were really going to try to monetize it. And the second theory that he had at the time, I didn't put much credence into, but as the months have gone on, I really think there's a lot of validity to what this second theory was. And the second theory was it had nothing to do with actually collecting ransom payments, the scarier kind of proposition. Anything they made, that $300,000 was just gravy to them. The real goal of this was to increase the cost of Bitcoin. Now that we've seen this huge spike and fluctuations over the last several months, it kind of makes sense. But at the time, it really didn't, because what we've seen over the years with Bitcoin, which is an online currency, anonymous, so it's very attractive to criminals, And they've been basically using all of these ransomware attacks to collect Bitcoin because they know they can't get caught. So even years ago, as they were asking for your ransom payment, they were going to ask for it in Bitcoin because they knew they couldn't get caught. And when you look at the cost of Bitcoin really over its existence, it's remained pretty flat. January 1st, 2016 was $443 for a Bitcoin. Beginning of last year, it was just under $1,000. And if you look at this chart, that first blip that goes up, that was May. That was May of last year when this WannaCry attack hit. Because what was happening was all of these large corporations, mostly in Europe, they were gobbling up Bitcoin as much as they can because they were waiting for that phase 2 that we mentioned. And they wanted to be prepared because if you're not familiar with Bitcoin, you can't just walk into a bank, set up a Bitcoin account, and get it funded right away. It could take several days to get that funded, and there's some limits to how much you could buy in a single day. So they wanted to have as much on hand as possible should another attack occur. And then once the market saw all of these folks buying Bitcoin, we saw this huge spike. And obviously last year it peaked out at almost 20,000 and started this year at 15,000. And you saw the stories of these savvy investors that got involved when it was $400 and made millions of dollars, or the young kid who bought some when he was 18 and now is a millionaire overnight. And those are great stories to read about. But the real people who made really big bucks over this big spike were the criminals. They had been collecting Bitcoin in the millions and millions of dollars when it was only a few $100s per Bitcoin. And then you saw this huge spike. And so whether this was really what caused that spike or not, we'll never know. But when you look at it, based on the fact that the FBI was already thinking about this back in May, there seems to be, a real validity to this theory. And that makes it a scarier proposition for small businesses, because even though ransomware's been scary and a lot of people have been paying, kind of the mindset of the small business community is, if God forbid I'm hit, okay, I go pay the ransom, I get my data back. But the percentage of businesses that actually do get their data back, that pay, is decreasing by the day. It used to be about 80%. Last year, about 75% of the people that paid got some data back. That number is now closer to 60%. And that really shows
and I
you
think,
what we're
Michael,
working
too,
with here.
Yeah, and I think that point, that's direct evidence in my mind to your point that there's ulterior motives. It's really not the money that they're procuring off the attack from the business itself. There's a bigger scope that's going on here.
Absolutely, and it shows you who's behind it. It's not the guy in his basement anymore. This is what organized crime is doing all over the world. Here in the States, Russia. This is who we're up against, and they're 2-3 steps ahead of not just the government, but especially the small business community. And again, sometimes the small business community and the business community at large is just being used kind of as a pawn into what some of these these criminals are doing. And we're seeing more and more that it's actually government agencies, foreign governments, that are doing some of these things. Last year we talked about this popcorn ransomware, which is a scary variant. I don't know, Chad, if you're familiar with popcorn ransomware, but it was pretty devious. You familiar with that?
Certainly aware of it. We have never had any interactions with it with any of our clients or anything hands-on, but certainly something we kept our eyeballs on and made sure we were putting the proper training out and trying to keep it off of our networks that we manage.
Yeah, what was really unique about this was you get hit with ransomware. Anybody that's been hit with ransomware knows that scary red screen, pay me my ransom in Bitcoin. But these guys gave you a second option. And that second option was, hey, if you go infect 2 other networks for me, I'll unencrypt your data. So they were basically allowing you to do, it really was. But I was doing this seminar, and a cybersecurity expert said that this was actually more devious than you even think. The thought process within the security field was that this, again, was kind of the goal of it. Really, it wasn't just to make some money. It was to disrupt the economy here in the States, because you wanted to create this distrust between competitors and vendor to vendors and all of these type of things. And whether that was successful or not, again, that's the mindset behind it. And then the second really large infection that we saw last year, the Petya attack, now the security agencies and the government are saying that it was actually Russia that was behind this attack. Again, it started out with the Ukraine. They wanted to kind of really impact their economy, but because it was so large, economies all over the world were hit with this. And so again, you're trying to figure out who we're up against here. And truly we're up against some really big players around the world. And when you look at the prevalence of ransomware over the course of the years, it's actually been around since 1989. So it's been around for close to 3 decades. and we'd see it blip up here and there, but really in 2013 we saw a big spike. This screen shows you the more prevalent variants of ransomware. There's about 4 million estimated variants out there, and so people ask all the time, okay, what's the government doing? They know it's out there. Well, they could put a lot of work into shutting down one of these variants, and they'd get a nice news story and a pat on the back, and then they'd be back to work, and they've got 3,999,000 to go. And so what happened in 2013 that caused this spike? Well, again, it comes back down to Bitcoin. Some criminal somewhere realized that they could marry this very easy delivery system of ransomware, marry it with Bitcoin, and know they couldn't get caught, and that's where we saw the explosion, and that's where organized crime stepped in. How much are you guys involved, Chad, with Bitcoin or the other cryptocurrencies? I know some folks out there have accounts just for their clients in case something this happens, but I mean, how involved are you on that side of things?
I mean, just being in the space, it's hard not to be intrigued and engaged in what's going on with the entire cryptocurrency community. Me personally, I'm a bit of a nerd on it, and I know we have some engineers here that are the same way. Just fascinating how it works, and what impact is it ultimately going to have. But I think the evidence is pretty clear that this entire economy is driven by criminal activities. I mean, what we're talking about right now. I mean, this is it. Anybody doing legitimate businesses, they've got their regular business checking account or whatever. But the guys it's crazy.
Yeah, and it's kind of a shame because the idea behind Bitcoin was kind of this utopian idea that we're going to create this currency that can't be manipulated by federal banks and governments and artificially inflated and deflated. It was going to be a currency that was truly driven by market reasons. But again, the anonymity of it, which was what made it, great for that idea, really drove criminals to say, hey, I could do a lot of things, not just ransomware, but, drugs and weapons and all these things that could happen. And so a lot of that Bitcoin is being held by criminal entities. And so that big spike, like I mentioned, those are the guys that are profiting from it. And when we look at ransomware, I mentioned the $1 billion number. That was a number that came from the FBI. I had $1 billion from July 1st, 2016 to July 1st, 2017 was netted by these criminals worldwide. But the impact to the business community was costing over $75 billion. So what makes up this large number is that cost of downtime that we talked about up front, is the fact that, I could pay the ransom, but I'm still down several days. What does that cost me? There's a number out there that the mid-sized business that's down for a week or more, 73% are out of business within a year. So the impact of these attacks goes far beyond, the few $1,000s they might pay in ransom. The impact is much, much larger. And again, it goes back to, the kind of competitors that we're up against here with the criminal field. And the two pieces of leverage that these guys have, you've got the left-hand side of the screen, your RPO. These are the two acronyms, and I know there's a million acronyms in technology. The two that business continuity tries to address, and really the two that the criminals try to exploit, are your RPO and your RTO. And if you were to take one thing away from this webinar, it's to go back to your office and see if you could answer these two questions. So your RPO is your recovery point objective. How much data are you at risk of losing at any given time? And is that an aggressive enough schedule for you? So very simply, if you're backing it up weekly, okay, you're at risk of losing a week's worth of data. And depending on your business and the size of your business and the type of business you're in, that might be aggressive enough. But you have to be able to answer that question. And that's the first piece of leverage that these guys have. They've got your data. If you're not backing up your data, you've got no other recourse but to pay. But they're going to realize that, most folks out there at this point have some form of backup. And they're going to hope that maybe it's not aggressive enough, or you're not testing those backups. And so that's their piece of leverage. But let's assume that you do have a good backup solution. All that data the integrity is intact, and you can restore that data. Okay, you've taken out that left-hand side of the screen, that first piece of leverage. The second piece of leverage, and this is the reason why most people pay, is the right-hand side of the screen, which is your RTO, your recovery time objective. How much downtime would you incur if your systems were to go down, if they were to be locked up with CryptoLocker? Again, like I mentioned, would it be 2 hours, 2 days? Most businesses can't answer this, and most people, their RTO is not aggressive enough for what they need. If you're an accounting firm and it's tax season and you're going to be down 2-3 days, can you absorb that? So this is the second piece of leverage, and this is where business continuity, through those virtualization capabilities, tries to reduce that as much as possible. So Chad, when you go into a business's site and you do like an evaluation, are these the two things that you're looking at, their RPO and their RTO?
Yeah, absolutely. Because the kind of the crux of and the advantage of the products that we have, all security aside, that RTO objective is a game changer. Most people don't even realize that technology is available. So oftentimes I'll take the calculator that you guys developed and I'll take that right in with me, on my laptop and just have that conversation right with a client and say, where are we at today? Where do we need to be? What kind of money could this possibly be costing? And just kind of do the math out, and it's usually it's very, very eye-opening. People don't realize that there's better protection that's available to them.
Yeah, and that downtime, there's some ripple effects to that as well. Loss of clients, loss of future clients. If your competitors are saying, "Hey, these guys are down, come over to us," regardless of what field you're in, there's some huge ripple effects to that downtime, and that's what leads to so many folks going out of business. Now, we did a ransomware. First ransomware study was in 2016, the largest of its kind. Then we duplicated it last year and actually got about 2,000 managed service providers to respond and a lot of small business owners as well. We wanted to get two pieces of data, two buckets of data. And it was a ransomware specific survey. And when we looked at the managed service providers, so folks like Chad and his team, most of these folks were highly aware of ransomware. 6 and 7 of them had at least one client hit with ransomware in the last couple of years. So they see how prevalent it is. 6 and 10, 60% had at least one client hit in the first 6 months of last year. We started this survey July 1st of last year. So in the first 6 months, 60% had at least one client hit with ransomware. That's the kind of number we're looking at. And although you see the stories about the universities and the municipalities and all the hospitals that are hit that make these sensational stories, the vast majority of these victims are in the SMB space. Of the $1 billion that changed hands, over 700 million of that came from the small to mid-sized business community. And what was interesting was the average payment was only about $2,000 to $5,000. So it wasn't a huge amount of money. The ransom wasn't really what breaks the bank here. But take a step back. Take $700 million and break it up into $2,000 increments. And now you see the size of the net that these guys are casting. How many businesses not only got hit, but had to pay? It's a staggering number when you really look at it from that perspective. And so $700 million, break that down into $2,000 increments. We're talking about a large amount of businesses of all different shapes and sizes having to pay. And then I mentioned those ripple effects. Of the people, when we talk to the small business owners, of the folks that got hit, over half reported data loss. And 75% reported business-threatening downtime. So the ripple effects go far beyond, hey, I got to set up a Bitcoin account and pay this ransom. A lot of these folks still lost data, and a lot of these folks lost so much, had incurred so much downtime that it really either put them out of business or almost put them out of business. And the reason why these criminals are so successful is from this statistic. 9 in 10 of the managed service providers, they're highly concerned about this because they live and breathe it every day. We just saw the numbers. But of the small business community, less than 40% were highly concerned. And this only went up 4 points. And remember, this was after the WannaCry attack, which now was on the front page of every paper. Everybody read about it, and they still weren't highly concerned about it. Criminals love seeing this statistic. So I'm sure, Chad, and your team, a big part of your job is just education, letting people know this is what's out there, and this is why you need to be worried about it, right?
Yeah, 100%. We very, very aggressively market towards, these topics and talk about them, just because of the seriousness of them, and not trying to fearmonger in any way, but just to raise awareness. In fact, it's kind of funny. I do a lot of speaking engagements, and if I ask a fairly good-sized audience, how many of you here have been affected in any way by ransomware? And there'll be, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 that'll raise their hand. But then when I ask the question, how many of you know somebody that's been affected by ransomware, almost every hand in the room goes up. And it's just, it's kind of, and I think there's really a duality of reasons for that. And the prime one being, based on what I see on the street, they don't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
Who wants to say, I just got ransomware? I'll as I gain trust from a client, eventually through a series of meetings, they're usually willing to open up to me and, tell me what has really happened and what their true concerns are. But for the most part, who wants to raise their hand and say that I got hit?
Yeah, I mean, the FBI telling you they think only about 1 in 3 ransomware attacks are reported. And I think it goes into if it's a small amount, they realize, hey, there's not much the law enforcement community can do. But I think to your point, a lot of people don't want to report it because they don't want that to get out there. They don't want their clients or prospects to hear, hey, these guys got hit, because it just has a bad stigma behind it. And you don't want to be known as a company that got hit with, a hacking attack. And so we see that. And to Chad's point, when you start talking about, all right, let's figure out what that cost of downtime. And he mentioned we developed a calculator to try to figure out, okay, tell me how many employees you have, average overhead, revenue generated, and then we'll get a base number of this is how much money you'll lose per hour per day. But there's some real life examples I want to walk through, and they're larger examples, but you could scale it really to whatever size business you are. But it's real life examples when we talk about, hey, this is how much they paid in ransom, but really this is what the cost of downtime was. And the first one is one that a lot of people have heard about. They had the first part addressed. They had the left-hand side of the screen addressed. They were able to recover their data. That wasn't the problem, but the downtime was extremely costly. And that was the San Francisco Metro Transit Authority. They were hit with ransomware Black Friday 2016. And to their credit, they immediately came out with a statement. They said, okay, we were hit with ransomware. We were asked for $73,000 in ransom. We have no intention of paying it. For one, the government recommends that we don't. But also, like I mentioned, we have a very robust IT team, very robust backup solution that we've invested a lot of money into. We know we're going to get back up and running. And so their IT team huddles together and they say, okay, how long are we going to be down? Because the issue for them was the systems that were hit were their fare collection systems. So they couldn't collect fares on their light rail or their bus system. And so the IT team says, well, we've done tests. We know exactly how long we're going to be down. We're very confident we'll be back up and running Sunday morning. So now they're looking at 2 days. What do they do for those 2 days? Well, they've got two options. Option number one, they could shut down the light rail and the bus system on the 2 busiest shopping days of the year. Obviously, not much of an option. So they went with door number 2, which was we're going to give away free rides. So now it's a public relations, great story for them. Give away free rides. This is great. Everything's up and running. So they gave away free rides on the bus system, the light rail for 2 days. Now, because it was a good story, we never heard much follow-up as to how much money they lost because of this, right? But luckily for me, there's a lot of data on their website, and I could do the math for them. So according to their website, they provide about 735,000 rides every day. That's coming from their website. I would guess on those 2 days, maybe that number's higher, but let's just take their numbers. Now, they don't break down of this 735,000 how many ride the bus, how many ride the light rail, but I could tell you that it's $1 to ride the bus, $2.25 to ride the light rail. So if they're down for 2 days, they lost anywhere between $1.5 and $3.5 million in revenue. That doesn't account for all the extra overtime that the techs were doing. Just in lost revenue, they lost several $1 million. Now remember the math. They could have paid the $73,000, hopefully got their data back and got up and running quicker, or they could incur this downtime. This is the math the criminals want you to do. They want you to say, hey, you could pay me this ransom. It's going to be far less expensive than being down for several days. This is the reason why so many people pay. And so I was doing a presentation earlier this year, and the head of cybersecurity for the FBI was in Manhattan doing his presentation. I actually went up after him, so I was hoping all my numbers were right so I didn't embarrass myself. But he actually told this exact same story. And he got up to the point when he didn't do the math here. He didn't say, okay, this is how much money they lost, but he referenced the cost of downtime. And he said, hey, I could tell you, I don't know how much money they lost, but I could tell you here in Manhattan, if this were to happen here, we'd lose $50 million a day. It would have cost $100 million in downtime for the subway system. Yeah, I mean, it's a staggering number. And so this is an example of me doing some math, the FBI doing some math. But the second example is actually a third party coming in and validating that cost of downtime. And this story I actually heard, I was on a panel with a gentleman talking about cybersecurity insurance, which is another conversation for another day. And he was giving examples about, hey, this is why you need to go out and buy cybersecurity insurance. And he gave the example of a utility company out in Lansing, Michigan. They were hit with ransom. They hit with ransomware. They had a very robust 51-employee IT team. They were hit with $25,000. That was what they were asked for. They said, hey, we've got all these systems in place. We're not paying this ransom. So after a day of trying to restore their data, they realized there was no other option but to pay this ransom, and so that's what they did. They set up a Bitcoin account. They got that $25,000 paid. And so, great, they started getting their data back. But the problem is, again, you're dealing with criminals. This is not an honest business transaction. It actually took them a full week, even after paying the ransom, to get back up and running. Now, this company had cybersecurity insurance. So they said, okay, once we get back up and running, we're going to start putting together our claim. And so they figured out that it was about $2.4 million in downtime that they incurred. Now, when they looked at that number, $400,000 of that was in system upgrades that they realized they needed. So they needed to really just upgrade their entire infrastructure. So they had to take out $400,000 of that, but they submitted a claim for $2 million. Sent it over to the cybersecurity insurance company. The underwriters take a look at it. My experience with insurance underwriters, they don't like to pay on claims that aren't real, so they're going to make sure that all this is valid. And at the end of the day, they cut a check for $1.9 million. It was a $100,000 deductible. So this third party went and vetted it and said, yes, this was the cost of downtime. Now remember the math. They did actually pay the $25,000, and that then feeds into the $1 billion that we talked about. But the cost of downtime was far more expensive, and this is what goes into that $75 million number. And so this guy's up there talking about exactly why you need cybersecurity insurance, and that's great. I look at it a different way. I look at it as, hey, they still had to pay $25,000. They had to eat the $100,000 deductible. They paid almost $500,000 in system upgrades. And when I continued to kind of dig a little bit deeper into this story, I saw an article 6 months after this attack that said that 25% of their IT team had left within 6 months, not because they were fired, but because it became a toxic environment, and they said, I got to go find another job. This is just too much for us. So on top of all of that, they had to go try to replace 25% of their IT staff. Now, Chad, how easy is it to go out and find really good IT staff? I'm sure it's not the easiest thing in the world. Am I right?
Yeah, certainly. Not in any way.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is the type of ripple effects that we're talking about. So let's look at kind of to close things out. Imagine if either one of these companies had a business continuity solution. What would that look like? Well, if this represents their server and it is encrypted with ransomware, instead of setting up a Bitcoin account, it would be a call to Chad and his team, and they would spin up that virtual machine. And as Chad mentioned, in a real-life example, he was able to get up and running in 10 minutes. And now this on-premise device is operating as your server. So while that infected server is being wiped clean or replaced, your business is still up and running. You've taken care of that RTO piece, right? And whenever that new server is in place or that infected server has been wiped clean, we could do a bare metal restore and get all that data, because while you're in that virtualized state, you're still taking active backups. So when you do that bare metal restore to that new piece of hardware, you're not getting back to where you were when the infection occurred. You're truly getting back to where you were right when you were ready to do that restore. You've not lost any data, and you've kept your business up and running. And so the benefits are pretty clear, right? You're going to reduce that downtime, take away that second piece of leverage that they have. You're going to be able to answer your RTO and your RPO questions, because you're going to set your schedule and know exactly how often you're taking backups. I mentioned we're automatically testing those. And what we do is a little bit different in testing. We're not just testing that the data is there and it's valid. Actually, every night we spin up a virtual machine in the background. We bring it up to a boot screen. We take a snapshot of it, email it off to Chad and his team. So not only are we testing the backup, we're testing these virtualization capabilities. And Chad, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say it's 100% ingrained in our process. We do get emails that are, verifying that there's a bootable instance of that virtualization for the day. And it is part of our process for our clients where we actually, regularly schedule kind of an emergency restore scenario where we'll go in and physically try it as well. So, just another protection that we keep in place. But tell them the really cool part, share the cool part about in the cloud. What happens there? I don't know if you're already going to get to that or what, but okay,
there we go. Yeah, so what's really great about this is that these virtualization capabilities are available both on the on-premise device or from either one of our data centers. So the reason why we chose those locations, right, opposite sides of the country, is one of the things that I learned when I got into the IT space. Somebody told me, no matter what you're buying, no matter what you're selling, assume that it fails. What happens next? So you've got all these security measures in place to make sure you're never infected with ransomware. But let's assume that it gets through and you're infected. Okay, great. We've got this on-premise device. We're going to be able to spin up this virtualization. It's great. All right, let's take it one step further. Let's assume that this device is down too. Maybe there's a fire. Maybe there's a flood. What happens? Okay, well, we've got the second copy of your data in Reading, Pennsylvania. Okay, well, let's think of a doomsday scenario. Whatever happens to your office, your server, your on-premise device is also impacting Reading, Pennsylvania. That's why we have a third copy on the other side of the country out in Salt Lake City. So that regardless of what's going on around you, you've got not only a copy of your data, but you have these virtualization capabilities. But really what propelled Datto as a company was Hurricane Sandy. We're located right on Long Island Sound. At that point, we were still an emerging company. Most of the folks that were using our solution were based on the East Coast. Hurricane Sandy came through. I could tell you, I live here in Norwalk. We didn't have power for 8 days, but this is what we're dealing with. But we had thousands of small businesses living out of our data centers, operating out of our data centers for weeks as their server rooms were being drained out and new racks were being put in. And a lot of those businesses wouldn't be in business today without those virtualization capabilities. And these were all different shapes and sizes. We've got a lot of financial services up here, but really all different types of businesses. And at the end of the day, once all those restores were done and everybody was back up and running, we were able to say we didn't lose a single piece of data from any business impacted by Hurricane Sandy. So once that news got out, it really propelled us into being, the global company that we are today. And so that's the cool part about that, the ability to have that hybrid solution that we mentioned, the on-premise or the 2 data centers. You have the ability to do that. And you could do some testing on those local and off-site virtualizations, as we mentioned, so you could exactly figure out what that would look like. Planning is key here. So working on, okay, who do I call? What happens when this goes down? How quickly can we get up and running? So lastly, we've seen this slide now 3 times, but I think it's very important, and this is what I'd like you to be able to answer with your business. If you've got a backup solution in place and it's good and you're testing those backups, that's great. You've taken care of this side of the screen. But without business continuity, how really, how could you answer that question? What business continuity strives to do is take away that second piece of leverage they have. And so with that, we did record the webinar, so if anybody wants to see a recording, we can get that out to you. If anybody has any questions, everyone is muted, but you could put a question in the chat box, and we can get that dialogue started as well. But Chad, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I would just add, when we were kind of talking about the piece where, you were kind of drawing some parallels with the subway systems and what happened in Michigan and all that type of stuff, I just can't stress enough, because we live in the IT world right here locally in our community, DogHouse does. It's happening local too. You just don't hear about it. It's happening every day. I would say probably average once a month, I get a call to go meet with somebody that's in these dire straits that, that really makes me feel terrible, because by the time I get out there to see them, it's kind of too late. Their data's gone. We can help them plot a path forward, but just because you're not seeing it in the news, just remember, nobody's excited to raise their hand and say, hey, this happened to me. It's happening out there in our community every day.
Yeah, and that was the question I was going to ask you, because that's what I see really all over the country, is people don't realize it until it happens to them. There's just human nature. It's not, if it hasn't happened, it's just not going to happen to me. That happens to somebody else. And then when you make that call, and say, hey, what do I do now? If you didn't take those steps ahead of time to get these, solutions in place, there's not much you can do to go to try to recover that data.
Yep, absolutely. And it's just heartbreaking to see too, especially with the smaller businesses that just really don't have the resources to recover. I had a construction company local in here about a month and a half ago, and the lady was just in tears. Everything was encrypted. Their backup was encrypted. They weren't checking it. They weren't testing it. And, just our hands are tied. And I just, my heart goes out to them, because they didn't even know who owed them money.
Yeah.
It was just one, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Where does the story just doesn't end. And sad to say, they did end up having to file bankruptcy, and they did end up going out of business. But it's just heart-wrenching when it's so easily avoidable with just a little bit of a proactive mindset, which is what we try to coach in our clients and the people we interact with. Yeah,
and education is key, and not just on our side, but that's actually what the FBI is trying to do. They've shifted their resources into educating the business community as much as possible. That actually came down from the head of the FBI. Their main way to combat these guys is through education, because there are solutions to protect you. And the sad part is, like you mentioned, The companies that are being attacked the most are the SMB community, mostly because they know they don't have, the criminals know that they're not usually making the investment to protect themselves. But what's even sadder is these are the most vulnerable. These are the companies that can't absorb being down. San Francisco Metro Transit Authority, they could absorb losing several $1 million. A small business cannot really afford to be down several days. And like you said, you see these sad stories. So, yeah.
Well, let me ask you, Michael. I know there's a lot of talk right now in the EU. They've got very, very strict regulations around this entire security topic. And their fine structure is much different. And we basically have nothing here in the States, right?
Yeah, well,
what do you see on that landscape? What's changed and what's new there?
Yeah, they're actually, it's taking place at the state level. So state by state, we're starting to see more and more. So the EU's got GDPR. There's 8 best practices out in Australia. So for whatever reason, the United States are a little bit behind in terms of regulations, but we're starting to see it up here in the Northeast. New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, they're getting very strict, especially depending if you maintain any of your clients' data, whether it's financial, personal information, you have to have security measures in place. And actually, business continuity is one of the requirements in New Jersey right now for that, to make sure that you could stay up and running. And so we're going to see more and more, and I think it's going to start taking place at the state level and start to spread. But I would assume that within the next couple of years, those regulations that we see in the EU and out in Australia, they're going to make their way here. And so, and once that regulation went in place in New Jersey, they gave companies, I think, 8 months to comply with all of these things. So it was almost impossible to get all these measures in place if you didn't already have a head start on it. So I see that coming, and I've got my Google alerts set to figure out all these regulations that are coming out state by state, and they're moving pretty quickly. I think that the government's finally realizing that we've got to step in to not just protect these businesses, but to protect the clients that these businesses have from infection and all the rest. I mean, are you seeing the same thing? Do you feel that wave is coming?
Yeah, and and it kind of ties into, there's a lot of big money at play here, it seems like. Especially in terms of the insurance companies.
Mm-hmm.
Where they were just kind of willy-nilly selling cyber insurance policies and not tacking a whole lot onto it. I see that changing drastically in terms of, okay, well, if you want this type of coverage, we really need to know what you're using on site. What kind of equipment do you have? What kind of procedures do you have in place? So you can kind of see the wave of it changing, along with, like you said, kind of at the local level, some regulations being put in place. I know Tennessee just did an update last June to what our PII and what a business's responsibilities actually are. So yeah, I'm seeing the same thing, just changing for sure.
Yeah, that cybersecurity piece is really important. What we saw a couple of years ago, it was really hard for these cybersecurity insurance to underwrite this because they didn't have the data. They know life insurance policies, there's data. There's, all of that data is available to them, and they could tell smokers and non-smokers and all the rest. And they're kind of now looking at cybersecurity insurance in the same way. How much risk are they taking on? If you've got no security measures in place, your rates are going to be higher. Because now they've got some data over the last decade or so that this has become prevalent. So we are seeing that there have been a base year rates on what kind of security measures you have in place, and they're going to ask you for a disaster recovery plan in writing. Tell me what happens if you were to go down, if there's a breach. And so again, it's coming really from all different levels, for sure.
Absolutely. Hey, and we do actually have a question here for you. I think would be best to answer this. Could you talk a little bit about what precautions Datto is taking at their data centers to keep information safe? And also on the same question, when it comes to auditing for HIPAA, Sarbanes, things like that, how do you guys handle all that stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of our data centers, we get audited actually every 6 months. We actually probably do audits even more often than that. We have SOC 1, SOC 2 reports that are available. They're public for anybody that wants to see them. We encrypt all data in transit and at rest in our data center at military grade 256-bit encryption. So the moment it leaves your device to go to our cloud, it's automatically encrypted. Because I get the question, how do you know that your data centers aren't going to be hit with ransomware? Well, just data cannot be encrypted twice. So once it's encrypted, that data set's not going to get to our cloud. And then on the local device, you have the option to either encrypt or not encrypt. That's something that's up to you. We wouldn't even have access to the encryption keys because people are asking, how do I know that somebody at Datto is not going to do something? We don't have access to those encryption keys. And so there's a lot of security measures in place. It's something that we are actively, making sure that we're not just doing what's required of us, but actually going above and beyond. And we're putting our security measures in place already to make sure that we're meeting the GDPR requirements out in the EU, so that when all that stuff comes, we're ready for it. And so in terms of compliance, HIPAA compliance, and probably our largest end user group right now are the small medical offices. And so, we've got an entire legal team just based on, making sure that as compliancy issues change, we're ready for that. And so anybody that needs any documentation on that, it's all public and readily available.
Outstanding. Outstanding. Ransomware in the cloud. I was at the event last month in Nashville, and one of the speakers did an entire piece just on the next front being ransomware for Office 365, kind of specifically targeting that type of an environment. You guys have some solutions for that, don't you?
Yeah, so we do. We're able to back up O365, Google Apps, and there is, that is the next phase. That's exactly right. I mean, we have been backing that up for several years now. And again, the business community is a little slow to realize, hey, I'm using O365. Why do I need to back it up? But we are seeing infections within those SaaS solutions. The other piece is people saying, hey, I'm a Mac office, Macs don't get hit. The only reason why the Mac numbers are lower is because the criminals, they're going to pick off the low-hanging fruit, and they know that most companies, other than usually if you're in the creative space, aren't using Macs, but they are just as vulnerable. And so you want to be, regardless of what kind of environment you're in, whether you have offsite, whether you're a Mac shop, whether you're Windows, Linux, you want to make sure that you're backed up, because there's no limit to what these criminals can do. And if they start to see that, okay, these businesses that have on-premise traditional servers are being protected, they're going to go to the next group of victims. And so are you what are your recommendations about folks that are using O365? Do you try to standardize and educating them on why they need to back that up?
Yeah, to the tune of where, we probably, I'd say in the last year, have just made that a standard part of our management process in terms of Office 365. So, we're just including it with the package. But, based on that presentation that, like I say, I saw in Nashville, wow. The guy actually, were you there? You were there, weren't you?
No, our team was there. Yeah, I personally was not there, but yeah, our team was there. Yep.
Okay, well, he did a live presentation on exactly how it would work. He had two computers set up, and he actually encrypted with ransomware his entire 365 inbox. It was just unbelievable, and it did it in real time. It just encrypt, and left it to where you could see the subject line. You just can't read your messages. And then sends you an email saying, hey, if you'd like access back to your inbox, here's what you need to do.
Yeah, and if you look at the user agreements within Microsoft, they have what's called the shared responsibility model, where they will guarantee the integrity of their cloud, but not the data itself, and they will pass that along. And if you look at their user agreement, they're pretty clear that they actually recommend backing it up with a third party in their right on their form. You can go find that. So, yeah, they know they don't want to take the responsibility for that.
Absolutely, yeah, it's spooky, and just the thought of this all. All this stuff going to the cloud is just, oh man, wow.
Yeah.
We got to keep our eyes wide open knowing.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's for sure. Well, I don't see any more questions, Michael. Anything else you wanted to hit on?
No, I encourage everybody to reach out to Chad. I think the best step is to just do that assessment. Figure out if you can answer your RPO, your RTO. You might be in great shape with what you have, but just make sure, at least be able to answer those questions, and then take a look and say, are these aggressive enough? Are we backing up our data often enough? Are we testing it? And how long would we be down? Have we ever done a true disaster restoration process? And that's where you can come in and help out. So I would leave that. Add to close it out?
Yeah, you kind of broke up on us there at the last little bit. But Yeah, hey everybody, just thank you for joining the call. And Michael, thank you so much for your time. I mean, I think that was a wealth of knowledge. We will be recorded, this is recorded, so we'll be sending it out, and we'll also be sending out some other information about backup disaster recovery, continuity, all that type of thing, in a follow-up email. But with that, everybody have a great rest of your day, and thanks for coming.
All right. Thank you very much.